Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. In recent weeks, Donald Trump has kidnapped the Venezuelan president, threatened Greenland and Iran, carried out airstrikes over Syria and Nigeria, portioned Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico, whilst earlier he's cast covetous eyes on Panama and talked of annexing Canada. So is America becoming a rogue superpower under Donald Trump? What precedent does this set for Russia and China's ambitions? And what does it mean for NATO and the European alliance? Those are the issues I shall discuss today with the US national editor and chief commentator of the Financial Times, Edward Luce. Mr. Luce joins me live from Washington, D.C. Ed Luce, 10 days after it happened, how do the American people view President Trump's action against Venezuela? Is it seen as a blatant and defiant breach of international law, or do they believe that his justification is legitimate and warranted?
Opinion polls have been really quite uninformative on this. Generally speaking, when an American president takes kinetic action, if you like, uses the military, declares some kind of a emergency situation, then regardless of what it is, there's a surge of public support in their commander-in-chief. And that may then taper off after a week or two, depending on what happens. In this instance, that just didn't happen. It's not like there's been a surge in public condemnation either. There just seems to be a sort of wait and see quality to public opinion on this, which hasn't yet revealed itself. So there's really very little movement in poll numbers. If this is the first act, the abduction of Maduro, to the gradual but increasing involvement of the United States in Venezuela, I suspect public opinion will turn sour. Right now, I think there's some admiration for the sort of quality of the operation that extracted Maduro, but not much understanding of the sort of context in which it happened.
Let's first, Ed, talk about the situation in Venezuela. President Trump has told the New York Times that America will be running Venezuela for years. The US Department of Energy has said it will control Venezuela's oil sales indefinitely. Is this some form of modern-day colonialism?
Yes. This is modern-day colonialism without the sort of pretense that this is a civilizing mission or that there's some sort of broader, motive. It's pure resource extraction. It's pure in terms of international law. It's pure brigandage. This is Trump going for the oil. Remember when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, he dressed it up and maybe in his own mind believed that he was bringing democracy to the Middle East, that he was toppling a dictator who had links to Al-Qaeda. That turned out not to be true. There was a number of, broader rationales for the invasion of Iraq that enabled us to measure the hypocrisy of that Iraq invasion. But as they say, hypocrisy is the compliment that vice pays to virtue. The one sort of plus point of Trump is there is no hypocrisy. This is absolutely raw, brutal resource extraction. That is how he is presenting it. And he said at the time and since, Bush should have just taken the oil. He couldn't understand. It was sort of incomprehensible to him that Bush wasn't taking Iraq's oil. So he's not presented this as Operation Restore Democracy to Venezuela or human rights. He's presented this as Operation Take Venezuela's oil.
Now, the paradox is that though Nicolas Maduro and his wife have been kidnapped and spirited out of the country, the Maduro regime remains intact. Delcy Rodriguez, his vice president, is now the interim president. Her brother Jorge is president of the National Assembly. The powerful home and defense ministers continue in office, and there are no American boots on the ground. So will this lot do Trump's bidding?
That's the idea that, in much the same way that Trump watched the Delta Force extraction of Maduro on his TV screen in the Situation Room, or in a sort of lookalike Situation Room in Mar-a-Lago, he would like, via remote control, the Venezuelan regime to give him what he wants. And that's partly oil, it's mostly oil, and then it's partly also kicking out the Russians, the Cubans, the Chinese. And as long as they do that, and he'll use the tool of the economic blockade of oil exports, because there's a blockade in order to, as a lever, in order to ensure that Delcy Rodriguez does do what he wants her to do. As long as that happens, Trump thinks he's basically running Venezuela. But it's going to be pretty difficult for a Chavista regime, which is steeped in Chavismo, in the sort of socialist Bolivarian ideology of that regime, which has been in place now for 3 decades. It's going to be incredibly difficult for Rodriguez to keep the vast amounts of sort of party cadres, but also the militias, the collectivos, as they call them, that are there across society, on side if she's perceived to be becoming simply an American stooge. So, I think we're at a very early stage in this saga. Let's say, by analogy, we're at the point where, American troops and Iraqi citizens were pulling down the statue of Saddam Hussein, and Bush is declaring mission accomplished. That's when the story really begins to unfold. I think we're at that point with Venezuela. It's going to get complicated quite quickly.
In which case, let me ask you, what is the precise role that America is playing? Trump has said America will run Venezuela till an appropriate, legitimate transition takes place. But Marco Rubio has contradicted that in a sense, because he says America will not be responsible for the daily running of the country. And in her early comments, Delcy Rodriguez said no foreigners will be involved in the running of the country. So what is precisely America's role? Or is it simply by remote control from outside the country in the hope that Delcy Rodriguez and the defense and the home ministers will do his bidding?
It's the latter, but what we don't have is a day after plan, and there will be a day after. There'll be challenges to Rodriguez's power that, if she complies, and if she doesn't comply, then the Americans will have to challenge her power. And Trump has warned that there will be follow-up strikes, and it could be a lot worse for her than it was for Maduro. In other words, he'd kill her. I mean, this is really a mafia operation. That's, this is the language of a mafia don. And she is, if you like, she's been appointed underboss of the Venezuelan neighborhood. She's the one who's responsible of getting the protection money and passing it on to the overboss, Donald Trump. And if she fails in her duties, they'll whack her and get a new underboss. That is the sort of implication of this. And we are going to get to that point. Sooner rather than later is my guess, although who knows? Precisely because the more she complies with her overlord, the more legitimacy will drain from her, and the more power challenges she will face domestically.
Why do you think Trump has not found a credible role for Maria Corina Machado? Instead, he's gone out of his way to claim that she doesn't have respect and support from the Venezuelan people, which clearly isn't true. And why isn't he speaking about holding elections? That, in a sense, would provide some legitimacy to what he's done, but he's avoided talking about elections altogether.
He doesn't like, and this sort of gets back to my point about, hypocrisy. He doesn't like neoconservatism. He doesn't like wars that are fought to improve, other people's lives or systems. And quite rightly, in the case of Iraq and many others, points out that they make those people's lives worse in some cases. And in his first term, he had a lot of more conventional Republicans around him, if you remember. He had people like John Bolton, who were urging, and Elliot Abrahams, who was his Venezuela envoy, who were urging that kind of operation against Venezuela to restore democracy. And he wasn't remotely interested. But when Rubio, his second term as Secretary of State, starts telling him about the oil, and reminding him that Venezuela allegedly has the largest oil reserves in the world, 300 billion barrels or more, that totally changed Trump's tune. Now, this also involved a build-up involving pretexts, like you got, with Iraq and WMD and Al-Qaeda. You had narco-terrorism with Venezuela, and you had all these strikes on boats in the Caribbean. This has nothing to do with narcotics. This is to do with oil. That's the narcotic here.
So it's greed and lust for Venezuela's resources that have motivated him, nothing more.
I think, there is a hemispheric coherence here, which he did lay out in the Trump administration's national security strategy in December, in which it's a more aggressive version of the Monroe Doctrine, that this hemisphere is ours, keep out. And Venezuela is obviously, Maduro's Venezuela was obviously in a form of alliance with China and Russia, and supplies a lot of its oil to China, and is also, and here's where Rubio's sort of particularities come in, because Rubio's parents were from Cuba. It's also very much the supplier of subsidized oil it sustains Cuba, the regime in Cuba. So cutting that off, was another sort of way of exercising hemispheric dominance. So I think that is part of it. But oil is, if you think, you see the dollar signs in Trump's eyes, almost like a cartoon, when people mention oil. He's strangely 20th century in his obsessions. Oil, petro-imperialism is how I would describe this.
Let's come at close to Greenland. Although he's repeatedly spoken about taking over Greenland, is Trump really serious? Does he truly mean it, or is it just rhetoric and bombast?
You're never entirely sure with Trump how to differentiate trolling, owning the libs, as it were, or in this case, owning NATO libs, from serious action. You're never really quite sure, because this is a sort of shocking thing, and it does get a reaction. So on those grounds, maybe that's what Trump's deriving some political satisfaction from. But no, I do think he's serious about this, because he's been saying it for many years, since his first term, and because there are different factions around him that have different reasons for wanting it to happen. I mean, there are the MAGA people, the Stephen Millers, etc., who hate NATO. They see it as a sort of a racket to drain subsidies from America. They want NATO gone, and this would kill NATO in one fell swoop. You cannot attack another member and expect the treaty to survive. Then there are the sort of brodigarchs, as I sometimes call them, the big Silicon Valley friends and funders of Trump, who see Greenland as a networked state opportunity, as a place where you can have crypto-fueled libertarian projects that they would own and sponsor, freedom cities, as Peter Thiel calls them. And so they would like to see it happen. And then there's Trump himself, this property developer. He sees real estate and he wants it. And don't underestimate that sort of side of Trump. That's That's him. And since there wouldn't be any real resistance, it would take a few minutes watching it from the Situation Room. He can have it very easily. And he keeps, in spite of every ally saying, Mr. President, you cannot do this, he keeps saying that needs to be defended. There's only a couple of dog sleds there. Denmark, isn't capable of doing it. And we want it. It is ours. And it is part of the Western Hemisphere, which technically most of Greenland is. And he moved recently Greenland to Northern Command, which is hemispheric, from the Western one, which is where Denmark is based. And he also appointed a Greenland envoy, the governor of Louisiana, a guy called Jeff Landry, whose express job is to get Greenland for America. So, I think it pays to take him seriously and literally on this one. I do believe at some point this is going to happen.
In which case, let me ask you this. How does he plan to get Greenland? The White House press secretary has explicitly said that military takeover of Greenland is not off the cards. On the other hand, Marco Rubio will be holding talks with Danish officials later this week to talk about purchasing the place. So what exactly does Trump propose? Is he going to buy it? Is he going to take military action to acquire it? Or is he just simply going to hope it falls into his lap?
He's not going to buy it because he would like to buy it, but he's not going to buy it because Denmark's not going to sell it. I mean, that's not on the table. And in fact, the more that he and people around him raise that prospect of selling it to of Denmark selling it to America, the more they dig in their heels. That's absolutely not going to happen. So I think that's been his plan A, is through bluster, through threat. He will intimidate the Danes into selling. And to his surprise, because small countries with fewer cards should submit, this has just sort of hardened Denmark's resolve. If you look at opinion polls, a government would fall if it sold Greenland to Trump. So that's not going to happen. So then we're going to get into, well, call his bluff situation. Is he going to occupy the place? I mean, America has everything that it wants in terms of defense, in terms of exploration rights, in terms of being able to open new bases if it likes in Greenland. So Trump's national security grounds for seizing Greenland are a little bit like his narco-terrorism grounds for abducting Maduro. These can't actually be real because America's got everything it wants. So I don't think they're going to sell it. I'm 100% convinced they're not going to sell it. And therefore, we will reach the point where Trump either annexes Greenland or he doesn't.
In which case, if he does have to resort to military action, is he at all caring of the fact that he'll shatter NATO? Does it matter to him? Does he think it's a high price to pay, or does he not care at all?
Oh, it might be an added benefit. Article 5, as you know, is the sort of key element of the NATO treaty, which is an attack on one, is an attack on all. It's only been exercised once, which was after 9/11, when the rest of NATO, Europe and Canada, invoked Article 5 and said, we will come to America's defense, whatever you need, we will help. And that did involve the ill-fated adventure in Afghanistan for 2 decades, which involved Danish troops. Now, 53 Danish troops were killed, but on a per capita basis, that's a much higher sacrifice than the United States made. So that's the only time Article 5's been invoked. If it's invoked this time, and Denmark has said it will, well, then, of course, Britain and Canada are not going to join Denmark in an attack on the United States. So the treaty will simply collapse. And then I think you will get, as you've heard threats increasingly from a number of European leaders, you will get America losing its bases in Europe. And these bases are immensely valuable to America in terms of any global operations, particularly in the Middle East, but not just the Middle East. And you'll have a field day for Putin, of course, because he's always wanted to see the end of NATO and sees it as a sort of a purely anti-Russian alliance. But again, that might be a feature for Trump, not a bug. He's a great admirer of Putin, and you know, in some senses, envies who Putin is. So yes, NATO would come to an end, and Trump wouldn't shed a tear.
And what about the Atlantic alliance between Europe and America? That is a special alliance that unites the two ends of the Atlantic. Will that shatter as well?
So we're getting into the rest of the West phase right now, because America has essentially left the West. You know, this isn't an aberration. This is a president who's not just gone rogue, but promised to go rogue. He's sort of present at the dismantling or the destruction of the American-led order. Now, there were many things wrong with that order, but it was an order created by the United States. And I don't think anybody had it on their bingo card that it would be the United States that would be smashing it up. And without America, you ask, what is the West? Well, it is the rest of it's those other countries. And I think the most important country in this instance, in this scenario of Greenland being annexed, would be Canada, because Canada would then be hemmed in on all sides. And we're seeing the beginnings of a debate in Canada about going nuclear. That's sort of how serious this is. There would be only one tool with which Canadians could guarantee some kind of deterrence against such a big and all-powerful neighbor as the United States, that is now hemming it in, you know, from the east as well as the west and the south. And that would be a nuclear deterrent. You would see countries like Germany and Poland talking about going nuclear, already having those debates. You're, of course, seeing that in other parts of the world for similar reasons. South Korea can go nuclear, I think, very quickly, and is getting increasingly tempted to do so. Japan. We're going to get, as you would expect, in a world where the hegemon, the Pax Americana, the one that guarantees or underwrites sort of some kind of global order, whether you like that order or not, whether you see it as hypocritical or not, the one that underwrites some kind of, provides a guarantor to some kind of order and has a network of alliances. If it's trashing all that, well, then you get rising disorder and insecurity and greater spending everywhere on defense. I think particularly with the Western alliance, though, you will see an effort to shore up a rest of the West. The relations between, for example, Canada and the European Union, and Canada and Britain, Britain and the European Union. You know, the Brexit thing is kind of an embarrassing thing of the past now, in terms of defense at least. There's just increasing cooperation. You would see an attempt to shore up the rest of the West and make it coherent. How successful it would be, I don't know.
But it does suggest that the world will become a more dangerous place.
It does, and it is. You know, to be fair, I think the world is getting more dangerous. Yes, because it's becoming more volatile. It's becoming much, much less predictable. If you're Russia or China and you've watched what Trump just did in Venezuela, and you've listened to the rationales that he provided, namely that international law doesn't matter. There is no such thing as international law. The only limit, and this is what he said last week, on what I can do is my own morality. Well, you know, when a sociopath says, you know, trust me, my inner moral voice will stop me if it goes too far, you know, that doesn't exactly fill you with confidence. But in terms of the comments Trump made about international law, well, I mean, you have a green light here for all kinds of regional giants, hemispheric hegemons, to do what they will. The strong take what they must, and the weak suffer what they will, what they must, will and must being reversed. That's obviously making the world a more dangerous place.
Let me raise one third flashpoint before I put you the question with which I framed this interview: is Trump making America a rogue superpower? I'm talking about Iran. On several occasions in recent days, Trump has threatened military action if the Khamenei regime shoots Iranian protesters, and now it's reported that over 500 have been killed in the last 10, 12 days. So are airstrikes against Tehran likely? Or once again, is this just rhetoric?
So I have, as you know, Karen, written a biography recently came out last year of Zbig Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. And I was steeped, because that's when the Iranian Revolution happened. I was steeped, in the hostage crisis, in the Ayatollahs taking over, the fleeing of the Shah, that whole unfolding drama that occurred 47 years ago this week, the Shah's exile. And now we're in a situation where his son, Reza Pahlavi, is sort of auditioning really to go back as leader of these protesters. The one thing anybody who studies Iran and America's history with Iran, and Britain's for that matter, needs to understand is that the moment the United States gets involved, people flee to the flag. This is the colonial intervener. This is the country that organizes coups and bombs you. And this has been the feeling for generations. So Trump has said he's locked and loaded and that he's ready to, bomb Iran again and decapitate its leadership, whatever it is that the Pentagon plans are that he's got under his nose. This will be a gift to the Iranian regime at a moment when it looks like it's wobbling. Because the Yankees are coming in and bombing us again. That gives them a flag to rally people around. And to prevent defections, particularly from the Revolutionary Guard, which is key to holding this regime together. That doesn't mean to say Trump isn't going to do it. As I think, you've probably gathered, I have a deep skepticism about the thought-through-ness of Trump's actions on a number of fronts, and I would include Iran on that front. This is an extremely interesting moment, but it is an Iranian moment. And I think a wise American president would leave it to the Iranians.
But Trump, you're suggesting, may not.
No, I mean, it could go either way with him. He'd said, look, if you shoot protesters, I'll intervene. Well, protesters are being shot. And Trump can this is, I guess, a strength that Trump has, and it might apply to our earlier discussions about Greenland and Venezuela. Trump can promise things that if other leaders promised, they would be held to those promises. He can promise things and just sort of forget he promised them or lie about having promised them. And it doesn't really bother him. So, he could simply allow Venezuela to go to hell. He could allow Iran to go to hell. He could allow Greenland to remain part of Denmark. And everybody, be saying, but you said this and that and X, Y, and Z. And he wouldn't really care. He'd just there would be another dramatic news development which would block out the sunlight or soak up the bandwidth, flooding the zone with shit, as Stephen Bannon called it. So Trump has not sort of made himself a hostage to fortune on Iran. But I think he's going to be sorely tempted to strike the Iranian regime if these protests go on, with, as I say, if that happens, unforeseen knock-on effects. This could actually be helpful to the Iranian regime.
Let's then, at this point, Ed Lutz, come to that question with which I framed this interview. Iran, Venezuela, and Greenland are, of course, only the recent incidents of Trump's high-handed behavior. In earlier weeks, he's carried out airstrikes over Syria and Nigeria. We know that he has covered his eyes on Panama. He's threatened to annex Canada. He's threatened Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico more recently. Is America becoming a rogue superpower under Donald Trump?
America already is a rogue superpower under Donald Trump.
So there's no question. It's an established fact.
I think it's an established fact, yes. And we're all making adjustments, India included, to try and account for this quite sharp change in the way the world works. And, that still involves wanting not to provoke Trump, appeasing him, flattering him, in many cases, while at the same time realizing that deals with them, are not particularly weighty. They don't have the sort of sanctity of contract in Trump's mind, and that you need to be doing deals with other people, including enemies, in order to try and hedge against the worst form of superpower roguery turning up at your door. And so this is a very, very dramatic paradigm shift, if you like, going on in the world order. The old one is dead. The new is yet to be born. But in the meantime, this transition, we have the superpower that set it up attempting to destroy it. And it's a rogue superpower. And what do we mean by rogue? It's run by a guy who wants resources, who believes the world owes him, who believes America's been ripping him off, will destroy alliances in order to get the money he believes he's owed. That's, I think, pretty much a definition of a rogue. I mean, I think it's a mafia. It's kind of a protection racket logic. But in terms of international statesmanship, that's roguish.
If America is already a rogue superpower, let's come briefly to the United States national security strategy. You mentioned it a moment ago yourself, which identifies the Western Hemisphere as America's principal sphere of interest and influence, where America will have its way, what Trump calls the Dunroe Doctrine. Do you think America is prepared to similarly concede spheres of influence to Russia and China, where they can have their way?
Yes, I don't think that Trump cares particularly about Taiwan. And, the national security strategy is notable in omitting any real talk of that, or indeed of China as a peer competitor, a great power rival. That kind of language isn't in the national security strategy. Ditto for Russia. Russia's barely mentioned, and not in adversarial context. So yes, the idea that you've got your hemispheres, your respective hemispheres, and you do what you like in them, but you keep out of ours, and we're not going to get out of yours, but you keep out of ours. So there's a double standard there, but there's also a sort of implicit green light to do things that are not considered to be civilized or legal in your hemispheres. Just don't come into mine. Yeah, that's a sort of brutish form of Kissingerian realism. I wouldn't sort of overdo the posh language, the sort of the international relations language that some people apply to this, because we are talking about Trump, and Trump's prides himself on being unpredictable. But yeah, it's a dog-eat-dog world in which bigger predators, have more of an advantage than smaller ones.
So to be specific, you actually do believe that Trump's behavior has, in a sense, opened a door to China's occupation of Taiwan sometime in the near or foreseeable future, and it's made it easier for Russia to continue its partial occupation of Ukraine.
Yes, and were that Greenland scenario to occur and were NATO to unravel, it's going to be possible for Putin to do more than just that partial occupation of Ukraine. He will see a broader potential battlefront, both conventional and hybrid, opening up to him to undermine European Western democracies. So yes, I do see that as the outcome of this, and in fact, it's kind of the inevitable outcome of this. With Taiwan, Trump's never been that interested in Taiwan, to be fair. He's interested, he thinks Taiwan's ripping America off in terms of having such a stranglehold on semiconductor production. And so that might concern him. But the one power in the world that he's really treating respectfully is China, because China's, it's got the ability to impose its own chokeholds on America. It's the one power out there that is able to answer back in kind when Trump makes threats or, carries out massive tariff increases. They have subdued and pacified Trump. So I suspect China is feeling a lot more confident about its ability to take Taiwan than it was a few years ago. And when Japan announced recently, slightly ineptly that it would come to Taiwan's defense. The Chinese punishment of Japan for daring to say that was swift and really quite maximalist in their language, because they realize that others are now having to fill the rhetoric that Trump has vacated, that America used to provide. Having said that, though, I don't see much evidence that this would accelerate or change the nature of how China looks at the Taiwan problem. They see this as an internal problem because Taiwan is part of China's sovereignty. And the abduction of Maduro is a sort of flagrant international piracy because it's taking the leader of a different sovereign nation.
If China is being given effectively a free hand to do what it wants in Taiwan, doesn't this also have implications for India's border dispute with China? Doesn't it also suggest that if China were to once again incur across the line of actual control, Trump is not going to come to India's support?
I don't think anybody can rely on Trump coming to their support. So the question really goes back to whether this would be in China's interests. And sort of the larger picture here, I think, is since America has gone rogue, and since it's not a provider of stability, of that global public good anymore, or aspiring anymore to be the provider of that, then China, this is a role that China can take on for itself. And you're seeing this in trade and commerce, where countries are trying to get closer to China that are otherwise rivals, like South Korea and Japan, because regardless of their dislike or distrust of China, they see it as being relatively predictable. And you can do a deal with China, and well, it's not going to suddenly rip it up the next morning with a social media posting. That there's some degree of predictability and reliability there that I think China wants and is making the most of. And we've got Davos coming up. You know, China's become used to Davos to saying, look, we uphold the rules of, global trading rules. America doesn't. In which a line of actual control, a repetition of what happened in 2020 would go against this great advantage that Trump is handing to China. For China, really, Trump is Christmas every day. I mean, it doesn't have to do much. Gifts just keep being given to it. And I think this would undermine the advantage that China is gaining from Trump if it started adventurism in the Himalayas, on the India border. This would go against that.
Let me then ask you one more question about China. Lindsey Graham has said that Trump has green-lighted his Russia sanctions bill, which imposes tariffs of up to 500% on countries like Brazil, China, and India for importing Russian oil. Now, it's possible Trump may use this power to threaten Brazil and India, but is he really likely to use it against China?
I doubt it. I mean, he has said that the oil from Venezuela can continue flowing to China. He just doesn't want it going to Cuba. And in fact, Cuba is getting most of its oil now from Mexico, which is a very interesting dilemma there. Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's leader, doesn't want to be Trump's patsy in terms of isolating and bringing down the Cuban regime. She's a left-wing president. So that's going to be another potential flashpoint here in the region. But in terms of, sanctions on Russian oil or countries that are importing Russian oil, I very much doubt that Trump's is going to want to start another trade war with China in which he's forced to climb down because of the rare earths stranglehold that China has. But he's quite capable of selectively applying it in order to punish India. There is no rule that says Trump is consistent and even-handed. In fact, there's a rule of observation that tells you the opposite. So I don't think India can necessarily draw comfort from the kid gloves that Trump now has on when he deals with China. He's got more of an aversion to friends and allies than he has to adversaries.
So multilateralism, as we've known it for the last few decades, the old international order that we've got accustomed to, which he's shattering, has been firmly nailed to the ground by his decision to withdraw America from 66 global organizations and treaties, half of which are in fact affiliated to the United Nations. And this includes the bedrock United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Trump is isolating America from the multilateral traditions that we've all got used to for the last few decades.
He is. He's present at the destruction. I keep using this phrase. Dean Acheson, Harry Truman's Secretary of State, wrote a memoir, Present at the Creation. He was Secretary of State, who helped create the Bretton Woods institutions, United Nations, NATO, all of the things that sort of we associate with the American-made world. And Trump despises those institutions. He sees anything with the word multilateral in it as meaning you are ripping off America. So yes, we're present at the destruction, a destruction led by the hegemon that benefited so much from the world it created.
My very last question, if the old order is finished and the new order is yet to fully emerge, and we're locked in a transition where Trump is destroying the old order, do you have any sense of what that new order will be like?
So I don't think America is simply replaced by China as the hegemon. I believe that after America comes anarchy, not China. And that's more dangerous, by the way. But I don't think China has the equities or sort of the global command or alliances to substitute for the United States. So America is the last real global hegemon. And it had an enormous amount of blunders and of self-regard and of arrogance and of selectivity and double standards. But I think in spite of those faults, we're going to come to miss that order when we acknowledge that it's gone. And it is gone. It is going.
So the truth is, we really don't have very much to look forward to.
Well, life's never going to be dull.
Yes, but there is some form of interesting evilness that one could avoid, couldn't one?
True. We are living in the Chinese curse. We're living in interesting times.
Absolutely. Ed Luce, thank you very much for your understanding and your analysis. I think you have opened up the eyes of an Indian audience in a way that many may not be able to sleep tonight. I thank you for the time you've given me and for your understanding. Take care and stay safe.
Always a pleasure, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.